Well, I'm really glad to be able to talk to you all about this topic because I know it's a stressful one for lots of people, for parents, for teachers, for me as a psychologist. It's something that comes up all the time, and I think that what makes it so stressful is that things are changing so quickly that that oftentimes the research on this topic can't really keep up with how fast the technology is changing, and so there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainty about how screen time and how media use are impacting our kids. But I'm going to hopefully talk to you about some of the things that we do know and give us a little bit of insight into how we can handle this and give you some guidelines. But before we start, since we're going to be talking about devices, I figured we should use our devices. So we're going to be doing, just a few times during the presentation, we're going to be doing some interactive polls, it's totally anonymous, just for us to kind of see what other people are experiencing when it comes to this topic. So before we get started, we're going to set this up. It uses an app called Poll Everywhere. If you don't want to download the app, you can also just open a browser on your smartphone or device and go to the website pollev.com, which it says right there, /DreamIPC. If you're using the app, you're going to put Dream IPC, which is highlighted in orange there, hopefully you can see that, in the username. Dream IPC is just the name of our behavioral health Nemours account. It's a long story why it's called that. But and then you can click join. If at any point it asks for you to put in your name, you can just click skip. We don't need to use anyone's names. It's just going to show up as anonymous graphs and things like that. So you can just hit skip if it asks for your name. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to get that set up. If anyone has questions or is having trouble, let me know. Yes, Dream IPC. Seems like folks have that set up. We're gonna do a practice poll just to make sure it's working, make sure everyone's got it. So pull it up on mine as well. Okay. So does everyone see this question on their phone? Oh goodness, people are already answering. Okay, great. So as people answer, you'll see the responses popping up, and obviously this is just a silly question just to make sure that it's working, but this is what will happen when we do the actual polls. No one's wearing a red shirt today.
Still working on it.
Okay. We'll give you guys a couple more minutes. That's totally fine. That's why we're doing this in the beginning. If you need me to go back to the instructions, I can.
No, I wrote it down.
Okay. The name of the app, it's called Poll Everywhere. Yeah, Poll Everywhere.
Once I get to the color shirt, it doesn't take me anywhere else.
Oh yeah, because we haven't gotten anywhere
Oh, okay,
else.
good.
Yeah,
good.
that's okay. Whenever we get a new poll coming up, a new one will pop up on your screen.
Great.
So most of them are going to be towards the beginning, so we'll be able to get to those soon. Yes, it's okay if nothing else is happening, because things are happening up here. Okay. All right, so that was a practice poll. We'll do some more. But first, I just want to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So first I'm going to go into a little bit of just the background of why this topic is so important, give you some history of technology, because technology and screens have been around for a while, but there's certain types of technology and screens that are more recent. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some current statistics about media use. Then I'm going to talk about what's the good, what are the positives of using technology and screens, because there are some good things about it. Then I'm going to talk more about some of the negative impacts that we know of, and then at the end what to do, talk about some guidelines for what we can do about it, how to balance the benefits and the risks. All right, So now we're going to get started on another poll. So there should be another one. It might take a second. There should be another poll popping up on your screen. And just think back to when you were growing up. Let's say like 10 years old. And just think about how many devices with screens were in your phone, or in your home, I mean. So probably things like TV, computer, and how many, there might be multiple of each of those.
Computer.
Well, I had a computer at age 10, but maybe not everyone. So, all right. So for most people, that number is pretty low. Like 1 to 3 seems to be what most people had, or 0 to 1. So not as many screens, pretty limited. So now think about your home today. And we have a lot more devices that have screens on them. And so think about not just the different types of devices that you have, but actually each individual device. So you might have more than one computer, more than one smartphone, more than one tablet. And now we're going to ask, might take a minute to actually think about it, and think about how many are in each household.
For the whole family?
Exactly, in the whole household. Yep, not just you. Yeah, so big difference there. So everyone who's responded so far has at least 5, more than 5, and many people have more than 10. You count everyone's phone, everyone's computer, TVs. Yeah, it's a lot different now. And that kind of lines up with some statistics that we know of from surveys that have been taken recently. So, this was a survey from 2016, so not too long ago. And you can see that about 84% of adults in the U.S. say their household contains a smartphone. 90% of U.S. adults say their home contains any kind of connected device, so something that has internet, basically. And this was 3 years ago, so that's probably even different now because this changes so quickly. And it says the median number per household is 5, which I think actually sounds a little bit low, but that was about what, everyone here had at least 5 devices in their house. So, I think this makes sense if we look a little bit at the history. This is kind of roughly when some different devices with screens were invented or became available to people in their homes. So, you can see the TVs all the way back in the 1930s. Now we have later in the 80s and 90s, we get personal computers in the home, laptop computers, but probably not a lot of people had laptops then because they're really big and clunky. Then fast forward to the late 2000s and early 2010s, and we have the iPhone in 2007 and the iPad in 2010, I believe. So, and I think that this makes a big difference, that big generational difference, because now that we have all these mobile devices, our screens can move so much more easily outside the home into nearly every moment of our day. So instead of your TV just being in the room and then you leave the room and you're not around your TV, we have these screens that go with us everywhere. And just thinking about some of the generational differences, nowadays kids who are currently 12 years old and younger, for those kids, the iPhone has been around their entire lives, and the iPad has been around the entire lives of kids 9 and younger. So there's a big difference between parents right now who probably remember, many of them may remember not even having internet at home or a computer, and kids where mobile devices have been a part of their life for pretty much their entire lives. So it makes it hard for us as parents and professionals and educators to be able to relate to that because we didn't experience that. So this is just some other graphs that show the increase this is the percentage of homes in the U.S. From about 2000 to 2018 that had broadband internet, so like cable internet, not dial-up internet. And you can see there's a really sharp increase there. Now we're up to like about 3/4 of U.S. homes that are connected to the internet. Cell phone use and smartphone use, and again, I think this just shows how recent this was, that we're up to, again, almost over 3/4 of adults who have a smartphone, but it's only been in the past 10 years or so. So it means that there's this device that's part of our lives, and probably hard to even imagine our lives without it for many people, but it's very, very new, relatively speaking. So as expected, mobile device use in kids is also on the rise. These data are from a survey of parents 0 to 8 years old. They surveyed parents in 2011, 2013, and 2017, and you can see that even in that short amount of time, it's a 6-year span, there's a huge difference in the number of devices in the home. So from less than 1% in 2011, less than 1% of kids 0 to 8 had their own tablet, up to almost half of kids in 2017. And if you look at the age breakdown, it's almost 60% of kids 5 to 8 that have their own tablet at home. Plus, almost all families, 95% have a smartphone in the home, and 78% have a tablet in the home, even if it's not the child's own tablet. So, a lot more devices in the home, even in just a short amount of time. I think there's also a big difference in how screen time is being spent because of those different devices. So on average in 2017, according to the survey, children 0 to 8 had an estimated 2 hours and 19 minutes of total daily screen time. That actually isn't a huge difference from in their 2011 survey, but the big difference is in those parts that are circled in red there. So these graphs show the share of children's time that is spent using different types of devices. And you can see that in 2011, the blue part, the darker blue part, is mobile devices. It was only 4% of their time. Now it's up to 35% in 2017, so 2 years ago, maybe even more now. So that is important because that means that if children are using mobile devices more, that means they have access to screens in a lot more places than just at home. And in fact, in 2017, many of these parents said that their children used mobile devices in the car, in restaurants, and even during at-home meal times. So it just means that, again, this access to screens is available in a lot more places than it used to be, even in a short amount of time. Not surprisingly, social media use among teens has also increased dramatically. Again, from 2012 to 2018, a 6-year span, we went from less than half of teens having a smartphone to 90% of teens having a smartphone. From 34% of teens using social media multiple times a day up to 70%. So a big difference in the last several years in what teens are doing with their time and the devices that they have access to. Just want to touch a little bit on technology in the classroom since we are in a school. And this graph is probably pretty old at this point when we look at these differences over the last 5, 6, or 7 years. That this is from 2012, so it's probably a lot different now. But there's still a lot of teachers reporting that they use a lot of technology in the classroom. And it makes sense that they want to take advantage of technology to expand their teaching methods, expose children to technology so they can become adept at using it. And in the digital age, that was a big thing even when I was growing up in middle school and high school. They were all about getting us connected, getting us good at using computers, things like that. So it's not just at home and in family life, but in school too, that kids are having access to a lot of technology. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it just highlights that it's everywhere. All right, so some of the key points from this first part are that, as we saw, there's been a really rapid rise in mobile devices in particular in households since their introduction in the past 15 years. So while, TV screens have been around for a while, it's these mobile devices which makes the number of devices higher and the places that kids can access them a lot higher in just the last 10 or so years. We know that nearly half of children 0 to 8 and over half 5 to 8 have their own tablet. Nearly 90% of teenagers own a smartphone these days. And while total daily screen time has stayed pretty stable, the time spent on mobile devices has greatly increased, meaning that kids and teens are accessing screen time in more places. And so it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's probably going to, become even more. So what does this mean for our kids? And I think, as I was saying earlier, because these mobile devices have become so ingrained in family life so quickly, researchers are having a really tough time keeping up when it comes to studying how this is all impacting kids. I mean, by the time a study goes through the whole process of getting grant funding and then being carried out, collecting the data, publishing the results, we're probably already a couple years behind where the technology is. So it means that the results may or may not really be applicable to where we are currently if things have already changed. I even saw I didn't include it because it seemed kind of outdated, one of the graphics from the survey that I was showing showed that teenagers use Snapchat the most out of any social media platform, and I'm pretty sure that's not the case anymore. That was from, I think, last year. So
That's so last year.
exactly. All right, so what do we know? Let's start with the good. Start with an easy one. So this is our last poll, but it's a little different than the other one. So this just lets you to put in some ways that you can think of that technology has had a positive impact in your life, your family's life, or your students' or your child's life. And when anyone answers, you can just type it in. It will pop up. Is it going? There it is. It'll pop up on the screen. Some really good answers here. Things I didn't even think of. We got lots of answers. So some different things that we found, I don't know why some of them went off the screen, but there's ways that we can stay connected with family, like through FaceTime. If we live far away, you can still see people and talk to people and have a conversation. Can share things easily. A lot of connectedness here, as well as convenience, right? We can find things really quickly. We can use our GPS. We can keep our children occupied. I think that's what child LoJack means. And we can play games together. Even when we're using the screens, it's still playing together and having a good time together. Communication, so answering questions easily, researching things well. We have access to so many, tracking people, that's great. Find a lot of, not just information quickly, but just the amount of information that we have access to is huge. So lots of positives. Let's see, so here's what some other parents who were surveyed said. So many parents of children 8 and under, so this was from that first survey, say that screen media helps their children with learning and creativity at least a little. So more than half of parents said that those things were benefits of screen media. And similarly, most parents of teens and tweens agreed that media technology has had positive impacts on schoolwork and education, a really high percentage there. Learning new skills like coding or like even just things you can learn on a computer, preparing them for 21st century jobs, exposure to other cultures, expression of personal opinions and beliefs could be a positive of things like social media and being able to express yourself, creativity, and finding peers with similar interests. So even if kids maybe aren't fitting in super well, because they're maybe a little different, fitting in super well with kids in their school, they are able to find other peers who share similar interests that might be a little different than the ones who they're with every day. So they just have access to a lot more of that. Here's just a quote, I don't know if you can read that, but it says, it's a mother of a 16-year-old girl who said they can research so much now, it helps a lot with homework, you don't have to worry about going to the library, they don't have to carry all their books, and on the World Wide Web, which already seems like an outdated term, they can find a lot of things and learn a lot. So again, that access to information and that benefit of having so many learning tools at our fingertips. Teenagers also see a lot of positives. in their own social media use, and they're much more likely to say that social media has a positive rather than a negative effect on how they feel. Some parents might disagree with that, but this is what they say. They say that they feel less lonely, less depressed, less anxious, more confident, better about themselves, and more popular because of social media. So you can see too that the anxious one is interesting because it was a little equal there, that there were more kids saying that makes them feel more anxious. Does screen media have learning benefits? So, a lot of parents see that there are many learning benefits, and teachers probably too see a lot of learning benefits to using technology. Well, what does the research tell us about it? So there aren't too many actual studies out there that look at whether kids really actually learn well from screens. But there is some evidence that multimedia features in storybooks, so this is like reading apps that might have like animated pictures or highlight the words as you read along. They are associated with increased comprehension and vocabulary compared to print books. And this benefit was especially strong for children at a higher risk for lower literacy. So having access to this means that they might be able to learn and get some benefit from that. Animated pictures, they capture children's attention. They might help with comprehension. But the key detail there in the study was that was if they matched the story content. So if there was just like a lot of things moving and a lot of noises and things like that, it could actually be kind of distracting and didn't really have much of a benefit. But if something was animated that was coordinated with what the words were saying, that did help with comprehension. And like I said, the digital enhancements can make learning more active, but they can also be a distraction, and it's a little hard to know at this point and pick out the details of what helps and what distracts. That's what we know so far. And a different example, I'm not particularly endorsing this specific math app, but this was actually the subject of a research study. It was called Bedtime Math. It's an interactive iPad app that provides daily math story problems for parents and children to solve together. And first graders who use the app with their parents, that's one of the key details, with their parents at bedtime showed significant improvement in math compared to first graders who just read with their parents at bedtime. There's no problem with reading to your kids at bedtime, but if they also use this app for that worked specifically on math problems, they did show some benefit from that in their math skills. And this was especially beneficial for parents with what the researchers termed high math anxiety. So I think that the takeaway from that is that it's probably a fun app that might have engaged parents in working on math with their kids when they might have otherwise avoided it, because maybe they felt like the app would sort of help them along. And I think that one of the other important details here is that it was important for parents to be involved. The app was designed for that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about how kids can learn better with parent involvement versus just learning from apps on their own. All right, let's see, what else? So some other benefits to learning that we can think about, but there really isn't research out there yet. I was thinking about, like we're talking about access to more educational content, especially for families with fewer resources. It's really stimulating and engaging. It might better engage kids in learning. Learning can be more active and hands-on with touch screens and even things like virtual reality. So, but there are some caveats to that I will get into. And there's the next part. It's okay to admit it. The screen does give parents a break. And parents can't be directly interacting with their kids every second of the day, nor should they be. They have to take care of themselves, taking a shower, taking care of housework, talking to a friend, particularly when they have really young kids. They can be much more engaged when they're interacting with their kids if they take the time to do these things. And so, these touch screens are really good at keeping kids occupied when parents need a few minutes. It's okay to use it from time to time. You don't need to feel guilty about it. I'll talk about some guidelines later on that are more specific about, making sure this doesn't happen all the time, but if it's from time to time, it's okay. And actually there were some comments about this from a researcher who studies parents engaging with their kids and attending to their kids, and when that doesn't happen, what the negative impacts are. And even he said that this is okay. So, And the key there being, again, that if it helps manage stress to be able to take that few minutes of break and get something done, then you're much better able to interact with your kids and engage with them when you're taking care of those things. And if this is what works, then that's okay. All right, so some key takeaways for the positives of technology are that teens and their parents see many academic and social benefits to increased use of technology and social media. There are many ways we can imagine multimedia technology could have a positive impact on learning, but there's not a whole lot of research out there yet to support this. A couple of studies have found some benefits to learning, but specific details might make a big difference, like making sure that parents are involved in the learning and that it's an interactive activity. As well as, if there's too many distracting multimedia bits in the app or things like that, it might not actually really benefit learning, could actually take away from it. And we just don't know enough yet about the details that make it beneficial or not beneficial. And I think it's important to keep in mind there's tons and tons of apps out there that claim to be educational for kids. And just because an app is educational in content does not mean it actually helps with learning. And that's okay, because it could still be entertaining and it's child appropriate, and that's fine. But we still don't really know what features of educational apps actually enhance learning versus detract from it. So you can't just expect that if you have your child looking at doing a reading app for hours a day, that's necessarily going to be beneficial to them from a learning perspective. Okay, so, didn't get to the end of that. And brief screen time can be a stressful reliever for parents by giving them a break. So, all right, now on to the bad. So, there's a lot of scary stuff out there. Parents, teachers, health professionals, they're really grappling with this sudden increase in mobile devices among kids and blaming screen time for everything from mood outbursts, behavior dysregulation, lack of focus, depression, poor social skills, to sleep problems, vision problems, obesity, you name it. Like I said, I think it's really stressful that we see this happening so quickly and we don't really know what to do about it. But what does the research actually tell us so far? As I mentioned earlier, mobile device technology has entered family life so rapidly that it's hard for research to keep up. But here's what it says. Screen time in and of itself is not necessarily toxic to the brain or turning toddlers into idiots or anything like that. It's not, looking at a screen is not going to, make your child stupid or anything like that. There are, I think the biggest concern that we know of right now is displacing other activities that are important for development and well-being, both physical and mental. And I think, and that's a really important point that I'll keep bringing up, but if there's one thing that you take away from this today, I think this is it, that screen time becomes a problem when it's taking the place of other activities that are important for development and important for health. Things like physical activity, sleep, face-to-face social interaction, and mindful eating. I'm sure you can think of other things. But when screen time is happening so often that it's interfering with these things, that's when it can become a big problem. And because now with mobile devices, there are so many more places and more methods to get that screen time, things can get out of hand a lot more easily than before. And I think that's where a lot of the stress comes in. All right. So, going off of that, we know that the tablet can't teach kids everything. There are certain non-academic skills that are best learned through real-life interaction with other people in the environment, like social skills and empathy, self-regulation, problem-solving and creativity, and sensory and visual motor skills. So before, when I was talking about how we think that maybe the touch screens can provide some good hands-on skills, that might be true to some extent, but we also know that kids learn sensory and visual motor skills, problem solving, self-regulation, social skills, empathy. They learn those things best from actual real-life interaction with the environment and with other people. And so when screen time itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when it takes away from these opportunities, it can interfere with the development of these skills. I'm going to touch on just real quick some special considerations for young toddlers, building on what I was talking about with parent interaction being necessary for kids to learn and benefit from educational apps. So research has demonstrated that the brains of children under 3 are not yet developed in a way that allows them to learn from screens. So in other words, learning something from a 2-dimensional screen does not translate well to actual real life skills at this age. Their brain just can't make that leap yet. Older kids can, but these really young kids, toddlers, their brain just can't do that yet. And so even if screens may be used to facilitate learning, you might use an educational app together, an adult does need to be part of the interaction and bringing these skills off the screen for them to stick. And so, it's important to keep in mind that non-screen learning is also important for healthy development for young kids. And even apps that claim to be educational may not actually benefit kids as much as they claim unless parents are really involved in translating those skills for them. Sleep. This is a big one, and we already know a lot of research about this. So there's several studies that have shown that exposure to LED light, or otherwise known as blue light, you might have heard it called, it suppresses, so this is the light that comes off of your smartphone screen, your computer screen, your tablet screen, TV screen these days, pretty much any type of screen. It suppresses melatonin, which is the hormone that we need for sleep. So your body needs to produce melatonin. That's why many people take melatonin before bed if they're having trouble falling asleep. Your body needs to produce melatonin for your brain to sort of turn off and settle down and be ready to go to sleep. When we look at these screens too close to bedtime, it can really make it really difficult for that process to happen. So it actually tricks your brain into thinking it's supposed to be awake and does not trigger that melatonin process, and so it can make it hard to fall asleep. And I know it's really hard with all these mobile devices to keep screens out of the bedroom these days, but we'll talk more about ways to do that later. But just know that that any kind of screen, or looking at any kind of screen too close to bedtime, can definitely interfere with sleep. And even if kids do fall asleep, it's probably not great quality sleep. I think I saw a study that even having the screen on and eyes closed and being asleep was still interfered with good quality sleep. Attention. So we know that touchscreen devices are very engaging. And they can definitely be a huge distraction in many situations. I think we've all experienced this. But for kids, I think the big concerns are distractions during homework, teens driving, face-to-face social interactions, and even at meal times, kids might not be paying as much attention to their hunger and fullness cues and might overeat if they're distracted by their device, or they might undereat if they're too distracted to actually pick up their fork and eat. So this is going back to a survey of teenagers. So over half of teens, I don't know how well you can see that, but it says that 50% of all teens agree that using social media often distracts them when they should be doing homework. And 54% of teen social media users agree that it often distracts them when they should be paying attention to the people they're actually physically with. And that was a jump from 44% in 2012. So now it's over half of teens agree, and they notice that these things are happening. And I think distracted driving is definitely a real concern. And 1 in 5 of those teen drivers surveyed said that they check notifications while driving at least sometimes. 44% said they never do. That means that half have done it at least once. And so when you have a new driver, that's definitely concerning. All right, so we know that these devices can definitely be distracting in the moment and can interfere in specific activities. But what do screens and mobile devices cause ADHD? Do they have a lasting impact on children's ability to focus and attend? And it's really hard to answer this question at this point. There are some studies that have found an association between high screen use and problems with attention, but it kind of brings up a chicken or the egg problem because, because these devices are so distracting, a lot of kids who already have attention problems might have a really hard time disengaging from them. They get distracted easily, they don't have a very good sense of time, so they lose track of how long they're using them. And so it might be that kids who already have problems with focusing and attention have more screen time because they're distracted by it. There was one recent study that I think was probably in the news that was looking at teenagers who did not, according to their own report, have like a clinical number of ADHD symptoms at the beginning of the study, and then they asked them about their symptoms again over time, and they also asked them at the beginning how much, I think it was how much social media use they had, and about 10% of the teens who reported the high social media use at the beginning of the study did have ADHD positive symptoms later, so they had enough symptoms that they would meet the criteria for ADHD, compared to about 5% who were in the low social media use category at the beginning. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind about this study. This was only based on their own report of their symptoms. Usually when we're diagnosing ADHD, we use a lot more information than that. The way it was designed, it didn't really say a lot. It said it had kids report their symptoms at different time points, but it didn't really say a lot about how those might have changed over time. And another way to think about it too is that at the end of the study, it was still only 10% who were above the threshold for ADHD. That means 90% of kids who were high social media users still didn't meet that criteria. So it's hard to say that a lot of screen use causes ADHD or has any sort of like lasting permanent impact on attention, but of course we still want to be mindful of the ways that in the moment in certain situations it can be very distracting. All right, so adolescence and social media, I have to keep talking about that because that's a big topic these days. So this graphic, I don't know how well you can see it, but it basically says that it's parents who believe their children's use of social media helps, hurts, or makes no difference in different areas. So the dark green is the percent of parents who said that it helps in that area. The light green or yellow is the percent that said it hurts that area, and the gray is it makes no difference. So they don't really see that it has any impact. So the parents' biggest concerns about their teen's social media use are in the areas of physical activity, making it harder to focus, and impact on face-to-face communication. Interestingly, on that last point, more parents believe that social media has a positive impact on relationships than a negative impact, and I think that really starts to highlight the really complex nature of social media and how it's really hard to tease apart the benefits from the risks, and we'll talk more about that. But so this is what parents think, or parents' perceptions, which certainly aren't nothing, but what do we actually know from the research? So I think the big thing to take away from this is that, as it says at the top, teens don't value, this research indicates that teens don't value face-to-face communication with friends as much as they used to. And this is data from 2012 to 2018, again, just a 6-year difference, where teens had to say what their favorite way of communicating with their friends was. And while half said they prefer in person in 2012, that dropped down to 32% in 2018. And it was pretty much on par with texting by then. Texting didn't really change, but the in-person preference really dropped. And so, as we saw earlier, teens do see a lot of positives to social media and kind of online communication. But it's definitely a different type of interaction. I mean, you have access to more social support, you have access to more people to socialize with, but it's a different type of interaction, as we all know. First of all, it kind of creates this need to be on and socially accessible at all times. Like you don't get a break where you're just at home and not socializing with anyone because you kind of feel like everyone's socializing without you, which I think is a common thing for teenagers even before smartphones, but I think that it's so heightened now because they can see everyone interacting without them. And there's this exposure to bullying at any time. Cyberbullying is a big deal, and it means that when you leave your bullies at school, they can still bully you at home through online, and that can have a huge impact on certain kids. Of course, not every child experiences that. There's also just this emphasis on appearances. So online social interactions through social media are very kind of like quantitative and quantified. So like, how many likes did I get? Did people like this picture? And then like, did I make it perfect? And what if they didn't? Then I have to change it. So there's a lot of this emphasis on like snapshots and appearances rather than actual communication. So, even though that increase in accessibility to interaction and support can be a positive for a lot of teens, especially those who might have difficulty fitting in with their school peers, these online interactions are definitely different and can open up some teens to a lot of negative social experiences during an already very vulnerable time when teens are trying to fit in, they're trying to develop an identity, what their peers think of them is extremely important, and this just kind of amplifies all of that. All right, so, you've probably seen a lot of this in the news lately because they keep coming up with more and more studies, but, thinking about what impact this has on adolescents as far as their mental health, there are some pretty alarming statistics that have come out, such as there's been a sudden increase in adolescent depression, self-harm, and suicide attempts since 2011. If you remember back from a lot of the statistics that we looked at, from 2011 till now is where we saw this really big jump in teens who have smartphones, who use social media. And so these statistics and this increase really coincides with that. And so it has a lot of researchers trying to figure out if what's to blame here and how this impacts them. And there are studies that have shown that this increase is associated with more screen time, and I think the key part of this is also and less non-screen activity time. So again, when the screen time is taking the place of non-screen activities that are important. But some things that they found were that heavy use of social media or screens, so 5 or more hours per day, was associated with more than twice the likelihood of suicide attempts than what they would consider light use, less than 1 hour per day. So obviously there's others who are in between that, but this was, I think, is kind of a sobering statistic. I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that there are many adolescents who spend a lot of time on screens and social media and don't become depressed or suicidal. It's definitely not all adolescents, but as we know, the risk does become higher when they do. However, there was a really recent study that just came out from the UK that suggests that this relationship between more screen time and more depression or higher risk of suicidal attempts and self-harm is mostly explained by cyberbullying, sleep disruption, and less physical activity. So again, it's not necessarily the screens themselves, it's not necessarily social media itself that is causing this relationship, but when they factored in or took these 3 things out of the equation, that relationship wasn't really there anymore. That association wasn't really there anymore. So they think that it's mostly explained by when one or more of these 3 things is going on. So again, how is the screen time use? How is this social media use interfering in other aspects of life that could have some negative impacts? And just a note that these relationships and these results are overall stronger for girls than for boys, which isn't surprising because girls are already at a higher risk for depression than boys. Excuse me, especially in adolescence. So the results didn't come out as strongly for boys than they did for girls, but it's certainly concerning. Let's see. So there's a lot on this graphic, but the key takeaways from this are that teens with low social emotional well-being, so those are the dark pink bars in this first part, overall report more negative effects of social media, things like feeling left out or excluded, that they've deleted social media posts because they didn't get enough likes, they feel bad about themselves if no one comments on or likes their posts, they've been cyberbullied. They report those things a lot more when they have low social emotional well-being again, it's kind of hard to know which came first. But those same kids who are reporting all those things and who have kind of lower emotional well-being also see a lot of positives from social media. So they say that it makes them feel less lonely, makes them feel less depressed, and it makes them feel better about themselves overall. So it's really, really complicated to tease out all the different impacts of social media in teens, and whether it's what parts of it are good for them, what parts of it are bad for them. And there's still a lot that we don't know about it. But again, I think that it's important to look at the big picture and think about each individual is different, and it might be impacting them in different ways. And thinking again about how it might be interfering in a certain child's functioning and what adjustments might need to be made because of that. Okay, so the key takeaways from all that. So screen time is, again, most concerning when it interferes in other activities that are important for health and development. So by itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing. A little bit of it is fine, as long as it's not getting in the way or taking away time from other things that are important that kind of need to be done away from screens. Screen exposure at bedtime interferes with sleep, that much we know. Screens can certainly be distracting in the moment, and there's some concerns about that. But there is little evidence at this point that it has a long-term permanent impact on attention. Again, that we still don't know that could be the case, but as far as we know so far, we don't really see that. The use of social media is really complex and may have positives and negatives, and high amounts of screen time in teens are associated with increased risk of depression and self-harm. But this appears mostly to do with cyberbullying and sleep disruption and decreased physical activity as well. Okay, so now what do we do about all of this? So first, I'm going to give you what the current American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines are about screen time. And then I'm going to kind of elaborate on that a little bit more. But right now, they revised their guidelines, I think, a year or two ago. And right now, the guidelines are for children under 18 months, no screen time except video chatting. FaceTime is okay. It could be a really nice way to talk to grandparents and other relatives and things like that. 18 to 24 months, maybe a little bit of screen time can be introduced, but it should be done together with a caregiver because of that important point that I made earlier, that they're not really going to benefit too much from it as far as like learning and things like that, unless the parent is interacting with them. 2 to 5 years, they say 1 hour or less per day. And I think a big reason for that is so that we're really making sure that it's not interfering in other developmental skills, like that sensory skills and social, emotional, and self-regulation and all of that. So we want to make sure that we're not taking away too much time from that. And for 5 years and up, they don't actually give a specific guideline. They used to say 2 hours. But now they've refrained from giving a specific time limit for older kids. And again, this is because the research doesn't really support the idea that at 2 hours and 1 minute, your child's brain is going to turn to mush. And as I emphasized earlier, the problems occur when screen time is interfering with or displacing other important activities. So it doesn't mean we have no limits. Setting limits is important, but the exact limit might be different for each child or each family. And the key here is limiting it enough so that kids are getting enough sleep, physical activity, completing other responsibilities, and I'm going to get more into that. Okay, so what I usually tell parents when I'm working with families who are struggling with this is to start by focusing on the non-screen activities and the things that you want your child to be doing that don't involve screens. So things like making sure they're getting enough sleep, physical activity, homework time, chores, social time with friends and family, meals, other activities that are important to you and your child, like extracurricular activities, crafts, family games, Legos, whatever else they like to do. And set your limits on screen time, like I said, so it doesn't interfere with these activities and needs. Now, I found this really cool tool. It's called a media time calculator. This is just an example that I made. It automatically puts in the recommended sleep and physical activity time for your child's age group. You can adjust it though. And then you add in your child's other activities that you want them to do, including school, the time they're in school, and it will tell you how much time is left for screen time. Given that we know there's 24 hours in the day, and they need to be able to do all these other things, it'll tell you how much is left. Now, when I did this, now, full disclosure, I don't have kids yet. I work with a lot of kids and families, but I was trying to come up with sort of a hypothetical school, daily schedule that seemed typical for, let's say, an 8-year-old child. And I was actually surprised how quickly the time got eaten up, where we're left with half an hour of screen time. And that's for a kid who, the 10 and a half hours of sleep and the 1 hour of physical activity were already automatically put in. I didn't adjust them. I put in 7 hours of school, which might be a little bit high, but roughly speaking. Half an hour for personal care and hygiene, 1 hour for, let's say, dinner, 1 hour for homework, half an hour of chores, maybe 1 hour for a piano lesson or something else they have after school, and that leaves half an hour for screen time. So you can go to this healthychildren.org, and I'm going to put it up again at the end, and search for this media time calculator, and I thought this was really cool because it helps us to really see how we can fit screen time into the day without it interfering in other things. If you're looking for a guideline that's more specific to your child. All right. So another thing I often tell families is to make it a family thing. Try not to keep it just for this one particular child, but lifestyle changes, they're hard for everyone, whether we're talking about eating healthy, exercising more, trying to limit our screen time. These tend to work best when families participate together for a number of reasons. I mean, you can imagine, it's setting a good example for everyone. You can help support each other, hold each other accountable. Nobody feels singled out. You're kind of all in it together. So, although of course it might vary depending on the age of your child and what they're involved in and other things that work well or don't work well for them, but try to keep the screen time limits fairly consistent across the family, including yourself. And set a good example. And this is harder than it sounds because I think that we are all, as adults, struggling with having these devices in our lives as well, and they are really distracting and engaging, and it's, I do find myself, even while I'm watching a TV show that I like getting bored for a second and checking Facebook or checking Instagram. I mean, it's just like almost like a reflex now. So it can be challenging, but it's also really hard to tell your kids that they shouldn't be using their phone at the dinner table when you're checking your phone at the dinner table. So it's just kind of part of the all doing it together and working on this together so that we're setting a good example for kids. One thing that you might want to try is to make screen-free zones for the family. And these are just some examples. You certainly don't have to do all of these unless you want to, but things like the dinner table, no devices at the dinner table, or no devices in the playroom so that kids are encouraged to play with the other toys during family games, outdoor activities. We're going on a walk and I'm keeping my phone in my pocket in case of emergency, but no one else has their phone. In the car, you can use that time for socializing and having a conversation. Having maybe a daily quiet time where everyone does something without a screen, whether it's reading a book or doing a craft or something like that. And in bedrooms, which that one I will push on, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. But so these are just some ideas of times where you might be able to kind of have a screen-free time or screen-free situation that your family agrees on together. But you can also have screen time together. The person earlier said that they really like playing Mario Kart with their kids and it's a great time. And there's definitely a lot of ways that you can socialize as a family using screens, and that's okay. Like having a movie night, playing video games together. Everyone shares their favorite YouTube video. Social games that you play in person, but that use technology, like the heads-up game. I don't know if you guys have ever played that. But we can still use our devices, but still be socializing face to face and enjoying that time together. That's definitely a way that we can engage together as a family, and that's completely fine. All right, so sleep. I always put a lot of emphasis on this because sleep is incredibly important, as I'm sure you all know, for healthy functioning at any age. It can impact focus, behavior, emotions, being able to do well in school, and physical health. And as we saw, it might be a primary reason that high social media use in teens is associated with increased depression risk when it's disrupting sleep. So the guidelines that most professionals, pediatricians, psychologists will say is no exposure to screens at least an hour before bedtime. So turning off all the screens and no exposure to those for at least an hour. That gives that melatonin process some time to help wind down the body. Keep devices out of the bedroom. This is way easier said than done. How each family handles that is up to you. Some families might find that too harsh or too difficult, and might find other ways to problem solve, especially teenagers, like having their phones in bed and looking at their phones when they're supposed to be going to sleep. But sometimes it's easier to just say you charge your phone on the kitchen table until you get up in the morning. I know a lot of kids and a lot of families like to read books on tablets because, like I mentioned earlier, there's all these interactive features. That is fine, just not at bedtime. Try to read some actual books instead of using the tablet before bed. Okay. This is something we didn't really touch on yet, but it's also, of course, important to monitor content. This has been true even just with monitoring what kids watch on TV before we had mobile devices. But having more connected devices, like connected to the internet, for example, means a lot more access to possibly age-inappropriate content. And so it's important to keep an eye on that. You should know what your child is watching, set any parental controls you can. If there's things that, don't need the internet connection, you can turn that off. And, your own family values and parental judgment about what your child should be exposed to might be different from family to family. But talk to your child about your concerns and what the reasons why you are concerned about them being exposed to certain things, and, just monitor and limit their content accordingly. Talk to your teen about the positives and negatives of social media, including safety concerns that are definitely important, and, and be supportive in problem solving if they've experienced negative interactions or cyberbullying. So I think the key here is communicating and what's important, and keeping that conversation open about your concerns. And I've heard that a lot of teenagers have a lot of similar concerns. They might not always say that in front of you, but I think that if you kind of keep the conversation open and set the limits accordingly, you can have some handle on what kids are being exposed to. All right, just some other points to think about. As I said earlier, you don't need to feel guilty or like a bad parent if you use a screen to occupy your child from time to time. It's a great tool for this. But try to mix it up with other ways of keeping them busy that don't involve a screen, so you can develop those creativity, self-regulation skills that I talked about earlier, and just, try not to have it be all the time. But, if all else fails, and it happens sometimes, that's okay. Let's see. Just thinking about electronics and screen time as rewards. I know screen time, electronics are very, very commonly used these days as a reward or punishment, taking them away for families. And a lot of the families that I work with, we use that. But I think it's just important to think about sometimes the message that might send to some kids. It doesn't work for every family as well. Thinking about kind of makes other activities seem like a punishment. And try mixing in other privileges as rewards. Again, this is going to be different for every family, but just something to think about. Keeping it interactive, especially with younger kids. And sometimes if it seems like we're really having a problem, sometimes it helps to go cold turkey for a while. And think about doing this as a family. Sometimes I've heard families talk about like, media vacations, where maybe while they're on an actual vacation, they decide that as a family, no one's going to be using their devices. And sometimes it can help kind of reset things a little bit if you feel like things are getting out of hand. I know that probably you'll get a lot of pushback from kids about this, but again, I think that's why it's helpful to do it all together and kind of, it's not a punishment, but it's just something we're all doing together to try to spend more time together or things like that. I know that's easier said than done for some kids. I think with all of these guidelines, what's important to remember is that every child is different. You know your child and you know when they are doing well and then when something does not seem to be quite working right. Some kids really struggle with even a little bit of screen time and may need more restricted time than others. And in the end, if you're trying a lot of these guidelines and your child is really struggling, it's important to seek help. There are folks like me who can help with a lot of these things or figure out if there's another problem that might be interfering and creating some issues that we need to address. All right, and then lastly, I just have some helpful resources, and I'll leave this slide up while we do questions so you guys can take a look at it, take a picture, write it down, whatever you like to do. Common Sense Media is where I got a lot of the like surveys of parents and teens. So they have some research, but they also just have a lot of helpful guidelines about how much is enough screen time, how much is too much, how to access healthy content. They have a lot of guidelines and like reviews of like educational apps and programs and TV shows and things like that. American Academy of Pediatrics has their own guidelines, but they have some helpful guides that kind of expand on it a little bit and what some tips that you can try. Healthychild.org is, I think, created by AAP, and that had the media time calculator that I showed you. Morris.org/kidscope is our new behavioral health webpage that has resources for parents. And kidshealth.org, also similar. So that's all I have. We're going to have some time for questions. Just something to note before we go into questions. I do try to ask that folks try to just kind of remember that I'm not in a session with you. This is not a guaranteed confidential place. I hope that folks will be courteous and not repeat things that we talk about here, but I can't guarantee that. So I do ask that folks try not to ask me specific questions for recommendations for their specific child or specific situation. For privacy reasons, but also because without really knowing a lot of the background and the context, it's really hard for me to make a specific recommendation, and not something I want to do. In my practice, I wouldn't do that. So try to keep things more kind of to general questions that can really apply to a lot of families. And if you do ask me a really specific question about a specific child or asking for a friend, because someone always does, I'm going to try to keep the answer pretty general so that it applies to a lot of people. But happy to answer questions. Yes?
I actually thought it would be something you might touch on. I don't know whether it's media or just books or articles that I'm reading, but I was under the impression that screen time was really changing the frontal lobes of our kids and how it develops. Is my takeaway that no, that's not the case as long as you're in moderation of these other healthy activities that kids are doing?
I think yes and no, a little bit of both. So I think the answer to the first part is that we just don't really know. There's not really a whole lot of support for that at this point. There are, I didn't really mention it, but because it didn't really feel like a good time, but there are some studies that are being done to look at like brain scanning and things like that to see if it does. And I think it was in the news a little while ago, and saying that there's maybe some evidence that that's the case, but it's really not strong yet at this point. It's really early on. There have been some studies done on people with like internet and like gaming addictions, which is definitely a real concern, and that have shown some brain differences. And so at that extreme, there are some brain differences that we can see. again, it's kind of hard to know like the timing of that. Were those folks, if they're susceptible to addictions, were those brain changes already there? Did the screens cause them? We don't really know. It's certainly a concern and something to be keeping an eye out for. But I think we just don't really know the answer, certainly, and I wish I did. But I think it's important to keep in mind that particularly for those studies on like gaming addicts, there are probably some kids out there or some teenagers out there who would meet that criteria. And that's definitely concerning and definitely something that that parents should seek help for. But it's kind of like saying like the consequences of drinking alcohol versus having an alcohol dependency. There's a real difference there, and so it's of course not the same thing, but I think that it's hard to apply those kinds of studies to a child who's just kind of using screens here and there. And so I think that you're right, that the key takeaway is trying to keep it moderate and trying to make sure it's not interfering in all those other important processes to develop their frontal lobes, to develop those skills that at this point, there's not really a lot of evidence that it's going to have a negative impact. But again, every child is different. Yes.
There used to be a center at the Institute for devices that would help handicapped children,
Mm-hmm.
like, with speech or
Yep.
with, so is that center still there?
It is, yes. I believe it's in the speech therapy department. They have that. They do an evaluation. They kind of match you up with the device. You get to try it out. They work with your insurance and stuff like that.
It's also centered at the University of Delaware, has the Delaware Assistive Technology Initiative, DATI, which is located in there's one in each of the 3 counties in Delaware.
Yeah, it's another positive of technology that we didn't talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, I think I saw your hand first.
So, we are occasionally guilty of reading books on
Uh-huh.
the iPad at night. And is the setting of nighttime setting just there to make you feel good?
That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to that. I think that Apple did put that in there in response to a lot of these concerns about the blue light. Most of the studies that I looked at had it on like the brightness turned all the way up. So, I think that if you're noticing that you're using the iPad at night on the nighttime setting, and your child's not having any problems going to sleep, they're usually falling asleep within half an hour or so after they go to bed and after all the devices are turned off, it's probably fine. But if you are struggling with falling asleep at night and you're using devices before bedtime, you might want to think about changing that and see what happens. That would be my recommendation. Yes, in the back.
What are your thoughts on, you talk about the doing things with children, even younger children, when you have adolescents and adolescents, and texting.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to teach them that good hygiene, certain rules. You identify who you are, you call someone, you speak, for Mr. Mrs., you don't call after this time, that time. But what are your thoughts, or could you speak to about monitoring your children's social media and their text messages, and sort of navigating, especially in that pre-adolescence, and how to do that with kindness and respect and the importance of doing that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really tough one, and I think it's a really tricky situation that I'm still figuring out how to deal with the families that I work with. And of course, it's going to be different for every family, but and depending on the maturity of the adolescent and how they show responsibility and earn trust in other ways. But I think that navigating that time is a lot about kind of that give and take of giving kids a little more independence, a little more privacy, but also being mindful that their frontal lobes aren't working so well yet, and they're not going to be thinking ahead very well. And of course, some kids are fine with that, but and so we experience that push-pull in a lot of ways at that age. And so for some kids where the lack of responsibilities there. First of all, it might be worth considering whether they can even have a smartphone, whether they're responsible to have that yet. I mean, there's this campaign going on. I think actually Bill and Melinda Gates started it to try to. It's called Wait Till 8th, and it's this idea that we should be trying to wait until 8th grade to give kids their own smartphone. That's a little bit beside the point, but I think I think that just making sure that you're talking with your teen about why you're doing this and involving them in the problem-solving process. Ultimately, as a parent, their safety is non-negotiable and not something that they can have much say in. But you can, talk together about how that process would look like and be able to talk about your concerns, invite them to talk about their concerns about it, and then kind of come to a decision together about what you guys think might work best. Again, ultimately, as the parent, their safety is your concern, and if you might have to set more strict limits on that, then for some kids that's what's needed. But I think it can go a little smoother when they are part of the conversation and feel like they're having a say in the process. And a lot of times when teenagers, and this goes for other things besides using social media, when they feel like they're part of that process, you'll see that they often are kind of offer a lot of solutions that you might have come up with yourself, but if you just told them that was happening, you would get so much pushback. So I think making that process collaborative is helpful.
I was just going to add that the Bo Biden Foundation website has some excellent resources for contracts that you and your child can develop together.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And having it having a contract that you agree on and have it in writing so that these are the expectations, and then if you meet these expectations, then you can have this much use of your phone, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't, then these are the consequences. And I think that's true for a lot of teenage activities, is kind of agreeing on if you can show me that you have this responsibility and meet these expectations, then you can have that certain amount of freedom. But if you don't, then that freedom's going to be rolled back until you can show that. So, yes.
I had a clarifying question.
Uh-huh.
There was this chart or the slide about sleep time and no screens an hour before and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were just talking about sleep, and it was, well, if your kid falls asleep quickly, then it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, was the research about quality of sleep, or was it around quantity? Because
That's a
my
good
child
question.
can fall asleep like that,
Uh-huh.
but he's not getting the 10 and a half. And okay, is the what are we measuring here? Quality or quantity?
That's a good question. I think it's a little bit of both. Having the right quantity of sleep is important. But if kids are up 5 times a night and getting out of bed, and even if their bedtime and their wake up time in the morning are 10 and a half hours apart, they're probably not getting, good quality sleep. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. Does that answer your question, or was there something else that you?
Yeah, I guess it was just with me, and maybe this is a better question for when we have the sleep specialist here, I'm not sure. But if it really makes a difference, what we should really be focusing on when it comes to before bedtime, and then how much time is really.
Yeah, so and this is with the caveat that this is I mostly talk about this with kids and families who are struggling with sleep, and so this is usually the first thing I go to is are they using the tablet before bedtime, are they watching TV before bedtime, those kinds of things, and because oftentimes that's the easiest fix if that's going on. So, again, I can't tell you each what to do in your own homes and with your own kids, and if there's no problem, you don't need to make one. But typically, we know that those screens can definitely interfere with sleep. If the brightness is turned down and it's more of like a yellow light than a blue light, that might help. I don't know that the research has really caught up with whether that makes a difference or whether that kind of cancels out the negative effects. And so I think then it comes down to what seems to be working for your child, and they seem to be getting a good amount of sleep. And yeah, the sleep experts can probably talk a lot more in detail about that piece. But yeah, the guideline is usually turning off an hour before bedtime. Yes.
Do you know of any resources videos, for example,
Mhm.
that we can show our children either at home or in school, just to educate them about internet safety, about cyberbullying, about all of these things that, because I think it's hard as a parent to know what to say to my child
Yeah.
about being safe on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But if I can show them a video that explains
Mhm.
what can happen and how to be safe,
Mhm.
then I think that might be a useful thing to do.
That's a really good question. I don't know of any specific ones, but I would guess that potentially the Bo Biden Foundation
It
or
absolutely does.
Yes,
Biden
great,
has
perfect.
some really great, and there are developmental differences between, they've broken it down in terms of age groups, which makes it a lot
That's
more
great.
appropriate.
That sounds like a great resource. I need to look into that. I think Common Sense Media seems to have a lot of resources like that as well. I haven't looked at any specific ones about that, but I bet they have something. Other questions? Yes.
How about just audio? If you have a speaker in the room, through the app out of the room, just listen to the fall asleep?
Yeah. I think being careful that their phone isn't like emitting too much light into the room.
The phone doesn't even have to be in the room.
Oh, okay.
It's just like a soda speaker.
Oh, yeah, I don't think there's anything that says that, again, I think this depends on the child because our general sleep hygiene guidelines, they say that the room shouldn't have too much noise. That being said, some people find that ambient noise really helps them to fall asleep because then they don't hear like the random noises that are outside or in the house or things like that. So I think that there's no problem with that. But this research was really specifically on the light that comes off of the screens, and we know that really tricks the brain into being awake and not falling asleep. So I'm not sure about sound. Again, that might be a question for the sleep folks when they come in.
There is some research that suggests that listening to podcasts or any kind of audio like that is disruptive to the early
Yes.
stages of sleep.
And anything that has like any sort of content like that definitely can be disruptive because you're paying attention to what you're listening to, and that can definitely kind of keep your brain turned on, keep your brain going instead of letting it settle down. And that's why I said, ambient noise or like light music that doesn't have lyrics or things like that can be great for some people. If it works for them, then that's great. But you're absolutely right that anything that's going to be like stimulating your brain too much or stimulating your mind too much probably isn't going to help. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. I'm glad for you that you came.